Hi, my name is Kate, and I'm here in southern New Brunswick to read for you chapter 13 of Jane of Lantern Hill. This is one of my favorite chapters of this book, so I'm excited to be sharing it with you today. Jane of Lantern Hill is one of the books that I have multiple copies of. Today I'm going to be reading from this hardcover copy of Jane of Lantern Hill that I got from my grandma's house, I should say, and I'm reading from it purely because the print size is a little bit larger than my paperback copy, so it's a little bit easier to read. So here is chapter 13. Jane was so tired after the preceding sleepless nights on the train that she went to sleep almost at once. But she wakened while it was still night. The rain had ceased. A bar of shining light lay across her bed. She slipped out from between Aunt Irene's perfumed sheets and went to the window. The world had changed. The sky was cloudless, and a few shining distant stars looked down on the sleeping town. A tree not far away was all silvery bloom. Moonlight was spilling over everything, from a full moon that hung like an enormous bubble over what must be a bay or a harbor, and there was one splendid sparkling trail across the water. So there was a moon in P.E. Island too. Jane hadn't really believed it before. And polished to the Queen's taste. It was like seeing an old friend. That moon was looking down on Toronto as well as P.E. Island. Perhaps it was shining on Jody, asleep in her little attic room, or on Mother, coming home late from some gay affair. Suppose she were looking at it this very moment. It no longer seemed 1,000 miles to Toronto. The door opened and Aunt Irene came in her nightdress. "Lovey, what is the matter? I heard you moving about, and I was afraid you were ill." "I just got up to look at the moon," said Jane. "You funny child. Haven't you seen moons before? You gave me a real fright. Now go back to bed like a darling. You want to look bright and fresh for Father when he comes, you know." Jane didn't want to look bright and fresh for anybody. Was she always to be spied upon? She got into bed silently and was tucked in for a second time, but she could not sleep again. Morning comes at last, be the night ever so long. The day that was to be such a marvelous day for Jane began like any other. The mackerel clouds, only Jane didn't know that they were mackerel clouds, in the eastern sky began to take fire. The sun rose without any unusual fuss. Jane was afraid to get up too early for fear of alarming Aunt Irene again, but at last she rose and opened the window. Jane did not know she was looking out on the loveliest thing on earth, a June morning in Prince Edward Island. But she knew it all seemed like a different world from last night. A wave of fragrance broke in her face from the lilac hedge between Aunt Irene's house and the next one. The poplars in a corner of the lawn were shaking in green laughter. An apple tree stretched out friendly arms. There was a faraway view of daisy-sprinkled fields across the harbor where white gulls were soaring and swooping. The air was moist and sweet after the rain. Aunt Irene's house was on the fringe of the town, and a country road ran behind it, a road almost blood red in its glistening wetness. Jane had never imagined a road colored like that. Why, P.E. Island is a pretty place, thought Jane half-grudgingly. Breakfast was the first ordeal, and Jane was no hungrier than she had been the night before. "I don't think I can eat anything, Aunt Irene." "But you must, lovey. I'm going to love you, but I'm not going to spoil you. I expect you've always had a little bit too much of your own way. Your father may be along almost any minute now. Sit right down here and eat your cereal." Jane tried. Aunt Irene had certainly prepared a lovely breakfast for her. Orange juice, cereal with thick golden cream, dainty triangles of toast, a perfectly poached egg, apple jelly between amber and crimson. There was no doubt Aunt Irene was a good cook. but Jane had never had a harder time choking down a meal. "Don't be so excited, lovey," said Aunt Irene with a smile, as to some very young child who needed soothing. Jane did not think she was excited. She had merely a queer, dreadful, empty feeling, which nothing, not even the egg, seemed to be able to fill up. And after breakfast, there was an hour when Jane discovered that the hardest work in the world is waiting. But everything comes to an end, and when Aunt Irene said, "There's your father now," Jane felt that everything had come to an end. Her hands were suddenly clammy, but her mouth was dry. The ticking of the clock seemed unnaturally loud. There was a step on the path. The door opened. Someone was standing on the threshold. Jane stood up, but she could not raise her eyes. She could not. "Here's your baby," said Aunt Irene. "Isn't she a little daughter to be proud of, Drew? A bit too tall for her age, perhaps, but—" "A russet-haired jade," said a voice. Only 4 words, but they changed life for Jane. Perhaps it was the voice more than the words, a voice that made everything seem like a wonderful secret just you two shared. Jane came to life at last and looked up. Peaked eyebrows, thick reddish-brown hair springing back from his forehead, a mouth tucked in at the corners, square cleft chin, stern hazel eyes with jolly-looking wrinkles around them. The face was as familiar to her as her own. "Kenneth Howard!" gasped Jane. She took a quite unconscious step towards him. The next moment, she was lifted in his arms and kissed. She kissed him back. She had no sense of strangerhood. She felt at once the call of that mysterious kinship of soul which has nothing to do with the relationships of flesh and blood. In that one moment, Jane forgot that she had ever hated her father. She liked him. She liked everything about him, from the nice tobacco-y smell of his heather mixture tweed suit to the firm grip of his arms around her. She wanted to cry, but that was out of the question, so she laughed instead. Rather wildly, perhaps, for Aunt Irene said tolerantly, "Poor child, no wonder she is a little hysterical." Father set Jane down and looked at her. All the sternness of his eyes had crinkled into laughter. "Are you hysterical, my Jane?" he said gravely. How she loved to be called "my Jane" like that. "No, Father," she said with equal gravity. She never spoke of him or thought of him as he again. "Leave her with me a month and I'll fatten her up," smiled Aunt Irene. Jane felt a quake of dismay. Suppose Father did leave her? Evidently, Father had no intention of doing anything of the sort. He pulled her down on the sofa beside him and kept his arm about her. All at once, everything was all right. "I don't believe I want her fattened up. I like her bones." He looked at Jane critically. Jane knew he was looking her over, and didn't mind. She only hoped madly that he would like her. Would he be disappointed because she was not pretty? Would he think her mouth too big? "Do you know you have nice bones, Janekin?" "She's got her grandfather Stuart's nose," said Aunt Irene. Aunt Irene evidently approved of Jane's nose, but Jane had a disagreeable feeling that she had robbed Grandfather Stuart of his nose. She liked it better when Father said, "I rather fancy the way your eyelashes are put on, Jane. By the way, do you like to be Jane? I've always called you Jane, but that may be just pure cussedness. You've a right to whatever name you like. But I want you to know which name is the real you and which the shadowy little ghost." "Oh, I'm Jane," cried Jane. Was she glad to be Jane? "That's settled then. And suppose you call me Dad. I'm afraid I'd make a terribly awkward father, but I think I could be a tolerable dad. Sorry I couldn't get in last night, but my jovial, disreputable old car died right on the road. I managed to restore it to life this morning, at least long enough to hop into town like a toad. Our mode of traveling added to the gaiety of P.E. Island. But I'm afraid it's got to go into a garage for a while. After dinner, we'll drive across the island, Jane, and get acquainted. We're acquainted now, said Jane simply. It was true. She felt that she had known Dad for years. Yes, Dad was nicer than Father. Father had unpleasant associations. She hated Father, but it was easy to love Dad. Jane opened the most secret chamber of her heart and took him in, nay, found him there. For Dad was Kenneth Howard, and Jane had loved Kenneth Howard for a long, long time. This Jane person, Dad remarked to the ceiling, knows her onions.